I've been waiting all season for this comparison between the KTM 390 Enduro R and the Suzuki DR-Z4S. And now finally, late but at last, here they are. So my colleague behind the camera and I immediately took them off to the Hungarian TET. And that's why today we're going to take a look at which one offers the better all-round package. Let's go!
I wait for someone to save. I want to tell you something new. You drove us both into a wall. I drive away through the night. I contemplate for a while. Don't you think you want to be for the best? If I back myself, I get sooner than this. Don't you think you want to be for the best? If I back myself, I get sooner than this. Don't you wish I would have been someone else? I want to feel your gap without making a mess at you. I want you to tell me something new. I want to tell you something new.
Hi there, thanks for tuning in. I was already at the launch of the Suzuki DR-Z4S back in May in Oregon in the United States, and just a few weeks ago I finally had the chance to try the KTM 390 Enduro R for the very first time. Both test rides, or rather presentations, were fairly short, which is why I was really keen on doing a comparison under proper longer conditions with proper testing opportunities. And that's exactly what I had already promised quite boldly in the KTM 390 Enduro R video. Unfortunately though, because of scheduling changes, the overlap between having the Suzuki and having the KTM was really tight. So once again, we only had a single day for the comparison. But Valentin and I still tried to make the very best of it. And where do you go as an East Austrian when you quickly want to get some loose ground under the tires? Well, at least our answer to that question was Hungary. To make the most out of our time there and to manage to do a tour in one single day that is versatile and I'd say as realistic as possible for an off-road trip or more of a mixed tour really. I'm reporting back from the studio just to do a bit of voiceover moderation here. And that brings us straight to the very first impressions, because to get out of strict Austria, we first had to tackle roughly an hour's worth of motorway. And that's actually relevant, since with dual sport bikes, it's not only about off-road performance, but also about how good they are for traveling. We also kitted them out a bit for touring, one with Enduristan soft luggage, the other with SW Motec, but of course we didn't load them up massively, so we didn't even come close to the allowed payloads, 184 kilograms for the Suzuki and a hefty 210 kilograms for the KTM. I still think we managed to get a pretty good impression of what it's actually like to travel on these machines, and the biggest difference is really the most obvious one, namely the gearbox. Suzuki still insists on sticking with the often criticized 5-speed gearbox, whereas the KTM comes with 6 gears. But what does that mean in reality when it comes to cruising speed? Well, I tried it out. The Suzuki can basically manage 145 kilometers per hour on a flat stretch of motorway, and according to the meter, that's more or less the maximum. The KTM, on the other hand, can do a fair bit more. It can quite comfortably hold a steady 130 to 140 kilometers per hour, and at that point it's only just entering the stronger part of the rev band. It's a fairly rev-hungry engine, so above 7,000 revs is where it really comes alive with its 45 horsepower, and that's exactly where you find yourself when you're cruising at around motorway speed in 6th gear. Which means you still have some room left to accelerate and can easily push it up to 160 kilometers per hour if the situation allows. With the Suzuki, because it doesn't have a rev counter or rev display, it's a bit harder to judge how much the engine is being strained, but from the feel, the vibrations and the sound, I settled at around 120 to 125 kilometers per hour, which felt alright. Yes, it can go faster, but like I said, it didn't feel good anymore. It has to be said though, both bikes do have high frequency vibrations, but in my opinion, it's not bothersome on either of them. Maybe the Suzuki has a tiny edge here, so a slight advantage, but really just a nuance. Where you notice a bigger difference again is in the suspension. The KTM 390 Enduro R is generally set up much sportier, which is also kind of typical for KTM. And especially with the suspension, you notice it. This WP setup is simply harder. The A4 motorway that leads from Vienna towards Hungary is in some stretches surfaced with fairly rough concrete slabs that have quite big joints in between. And these are soaked up really nicely by the KYB suspension on the Suzuki. Whereas on the KTM, you feel them quite clearly. Both suspensions are fully adjustable though, and later on we even softened up the KTM a little bit. Both also have a fairly wide adjustment range. So when you change something, you can actually feel the difference. You can tame the KTM a bit, but that basic contrast remains on the Suzuki with its really smooth plush response and the KTM with its sportier character. And those differences in suspension behavior carry on once you get onto country roads, of which we had quite a few to deal with in Hungary. But to be fair, finding a really twisty set of bends in Hungary isn't all that easy. So here I'm mostly drawing on my memories and experiences either from America or from Austrian back roads. And there you also notice that the steering behavior is different. The Suzuki is much more agile, it tips more willingly into lean, needs less input on the bars, while the KTM does it in a slightly more neutral, slower way, which in turn, together with the suspension, makes it feel a bit more stable. There are of course several reasons for this. For one, the Suzuki has a noticeably narrower rear tire, a 120 compared to a 140 on the KTM. Then there's also the weight difference. We actually put the bikes on our 1000 PS scales, and fully fueled the DR-Z came in at 152 kilograms. The KTM, on the other hand, was 15 kilograms heavier at 167. That too can make a difference, just like the tires IRC Trail Winner on the Suzuki and Metzeler Karoo 4 on the KTM. But in principle, both machines are perfectly capable of being ridden quite fluidly and with confidence over a winding back road. The braking systems are more designed for off-road use, so the bite point is rather soft. But that's fine, because as I said, the bike's overall weight is still fairly manageable. But what about drive in general? Which machine is actually quicker? After all, we've got different weights here, and at the same time the KTM has more power. In terms of displacement though, the engines are actually very close. 398 cubic centimeters on the Suzuki and 398.7 on the KTM. The Suzuki puts out 38 horsepower at 8,000 revs per minute and 37 Newton meters of torque at 6,500 revs. The KTM delivers 45 horsepower at 8,500 revs and 39 Newton meters of torque at 7,000 revs. So on paper they're pretty close, which is why we simply did a roll-on test, third and fourth gear, accelerating from 50 to 100 kilometers per hour. Sheep and I are both more or less the same weight, so we tried to keep it as fair as possible. And the result was that, although the figures on paper don't really suggest it, the Suzuki actually has a noticeably meatier torque character that you feel all the time, and so it just accelerates faster. In third and fourth gear it was a fairly clear win for the Suzuki, although in third gear it was very close again because of the rev limiter. The KTM only gained the advantage when we tried the same thing in second gear, because then you couldn't make it without shifting, and that's where the KTM really benefits. First from the very well functioning quick shifter, and second from the wider rev range, which just makes it easier when you need to shift in a sporty and precise way. On the Suzuki you're basically relying on feel and sound, and that meant I ended up bouncing off the rev limiter 2 times out of 3. So in that case the point clearly goes to the KTM. But these differences in engine character then become especially relevant when we get to what's really the most exciting part: off-road riding. So, off-road riding. Basically the Danube wetlands right on the Hungarian-Slovak border offer a wide variety of tracks. All of it is of course very flat, but you've got really wide gravel roads, sometimes with deeper gravel. You've got river crossings here and there, and you've also got very muddy forest paths, those logging tracks with plenty of bits of wood scattered around. I'd say it's not challenging terrain, but it is versatile terrain where you can ride at different speeds. And what stands out here is that, especially when you're going at a quicker pace, the KTM once again feels more stable. That's not only down to the suspension, but also because you feel more comfortable at speed thanks to the ergonomics. On the KTM, the handlebar sits lower, the foot pegs are a bit further away from the bars, and so for our roughly 185 height, that worked out just about perfectly to take on an active standing position, while still being able to stand more relaxed on easier sections without ending up hunched over the bike. The Suzuki's handlebar is a bit higher and further forward, and combined with the agility I mentioned earlier, it can feel a little more nervous. For example, when you head into a gravel corner with a bit of enthusiasm and suddenly there's a strip of deeper gravel or some larger loose stones rolling about, the KTM simply irons that out more precisely and calmly than the Suzuki. And you also notice this ergonomic difference once we left the Danube wetlands and headed towards some of the few hills Hungary has, where we tried a few climbs and descents. It wasn't ambitious or particularly difficult terrain, but it was enough to get a bit of an impression. And here again, on the way up, the KTM just gave you that little bit more room towards the front to keep the bars loose, whereas on the Suzuki you tend to pull yourself forward a bit more, cling onto the bars, which is exactly what you don't want. So these ergonomic differences felt a bit restrictive, at least for our body height. But whether it was in the hills or back in the Danube wetlands, the next point, the next difference was for me actually the decisive factor why, if I had to, I'd pick one of these two bikes over the other. And that was this. While the KTM benefits from its ergonomics, from the sportier suspension setup, from its stability at higher speeds in open terrain, the Suzuki comes into its own as soon as things slow down, as soon as it gets a bit more technical. Because on the KTM, the clutch that isn't all that easy to modulate, the ref-hungry nature of the engine, and a few quirks of the ride-by-wire throttle make it at times a bit of a hassle. The Suzuki, on the other hand, has that torquey engine, a proper enduro motor. It lets you trundle along in second gear at really slow speeds with total confidence. Add to that an extremely light and super easy clutch with a very smooth bite point, plus an impressively large steering angle, which on the KTM is much more restrictive. All of that means you can calmly and confidently weave between trees, balance through tricky sections, or when you come across those repeated mud holes back in the Danube area, you can just plod through them with ease. If you need power, just a small flick of the wrist and immediately there's torque and drive. On the KTM, it's not nearly as straightforward. When you're riding slowly, you constantly have to switch between first and second gear because the engine really isn't a fan of low revs. On top of that, the clutch engages quite late, and that engagement isn't as smooth or as predictable as on the Suzuki. The engine also has very little flywheel effect and tends to stall a bit. So it can easily happen that, especially when you're just switching over and not yet used to it, you don't give it enough throttle because of the slightly odd clutch feel and because the engine always demands more revs, and then it just cuts out on you. But we also noticed a couple of quirks with the ride-by-wire. For example, at low revs, there's this slight delay when you blip the throttle. And twice the bike actually stalled on us, even though the clutch was fully pulled in. These are small nuances, but what's the effect overall? Well, with the KTM I ended up riding, and my colleague as well, Badini, pretty much like a beginner, keeping the revs really high, giving it loads of throttle, just to make sure the engine wouldn't stall, and that simply makes slow maneuvers more stressful. Plus, the lack of torque down low means you can't just flick your wrist and instantly get a little burst of power. That's something I personally really missed because it's exactly what I'm used to on enduros. I also ride the Tenere, and the CPC is another torquey motor. So I'd say this is a problem that hardcore off-roaders probably won't notice as much, if at all. Because if you're always blasting along on the throttle with momentum and drive through the terrain, you won't run into this situation. But if you're the kind of rider who enjoys just plodding along more calmly, then I dare say you'll probably prefer the Suzuki here. And that brings us to the first slightly sketchy part. A little river crossing. Doesn't look all that deep, but it'll be exciting nonetheless. First off, you can't see at all what's underneath. It's probably muddy, but above all, one of the most common criticisms of the KTM has been that the exhaust on an enduro shouldn't be routed so low, especially because of river crossings like this. So let's give that a try right now.
Easy! Easy! Da hat's ja duscht! Ah, war schon nass, Alter! War schon nass! Bis da runterrinnt! Ja, die KTM hat kein Problem gehabt, aber bei dir ist nicht. Ja, Gott sei Dank ist warm.
Bottom line, both bikes are absolutely fun to ride on loose ground. The ergonomics are generally good with just a few small differences. Both suspensions work well. As for the brakes, both could use a bit more modulation at the rear, but at the front they are nicely done, not too aggressive. You also get electronics on board, switchable traction control and the Suzuki's gravel mode. A really good Jesus take the wheel mode, which still allows enough slip so you can dig your way through deeper gravel. ABS can be switched off at the rear only or completely on both bikes. So they tick all the boxes, they both offer loads of fun, but how much fun you get out of them depends entirely on your riding style. And it's pretty much opposite. The KTM shines more at higher speeds, while the Suzuki is more enjoyable when you're riding slow, relaxed, even playful. But in the off-road world, and especially with bikes like these that are meant not only for off-road but also for traveling, it's not just about riding performance. With enduros and with adventure bikes in general, it's not only about how they ride, because you're often out in remote areas, often on your own or just with your group. A good measure of robustness, of adventure suitability, let's call it, is always a big advantage. And that's exactly what we're going to take a look at now. First off, what tools do we get on board? Here we go. Now I just need to find the hole, and then we'll open it up, and then out comes the tool you need to remove the seat. So after opening up this side panel with the key, we're given this generous little toolkit. I went straight ahead to loosen the screws here, but now I can see, with the plastic a bit out of the way, that there are still 2 more screws holding the whole seat, which means that to look under the seat, you pretty much have to strip half the bike. All right then, let's get on with it. All of them are nice and tight. Right, moment of truth, I've already loosened this one. Okay, good news, and we found the air filter, which means we don't actually have to take off the seat. I just wanted to check the air filter and see what tools we had, and with this tool, yes, I could already get to it. I could loosen the screw here and reach the filter, though judging by how dirty it all looks, I might not actually want to do that. How many screws is it? Just the one? A Phillips head screw here, as far as I can tell. All right, so let's count this together. To get to the air filter, it's insert the key, remove the cover, take out the toolkit, loosen screw 1, screw 2, and screw 3. And if you don't want to fiddle around in between this half-hanging side panel and the rest of the engine, then there's also this bayonet catch you can undo. So sheep led me a bit astray there. But I'd say it's typically us, we never read the manuals. And that's how you end up with situations like this. Maybe we just can't read. Anyway, let's see how it goes with the KTM. Actually, before that, one thing I just noticed. The battery here on the Suzuki is quite well placed, weight-wise, and reasonably protected from water too. Good. Let's hope things are a bit simpler, or at least more intuitive on the KTM. We'll just take off our beloved SW Motec Cowpad bag, which has been on countless tours already and has never shied away even from so-called harder off-road adventures. Now, where's the opening? As usual, right at the side of the tail, no mishaps there. Everything's labeled, even for the truly clueless. Airbox access, it says right on the KTM's side panel. What does that mean? Air filter box access. Okay, quick check. Is this the battery? Or what is this box here? Wait. Yes, that's the battery with all the fuses, very easy to reach. And then the tool kit. And look at that, actually more than on the Suzuki. You could even tighten the mirrors with this, which, by the way, are loose again. Right, so now I'm down on the ground, and then the air filter. That's how it works. Okay, no big deal. Is it still caught somewhere? Yes, down there's another one hidden away. What's that? A small one? What is that supposed to be? Yes, just a small plastic plug. And now, there we go, right? I just hadn't dared to pull hard enough. So 1 small bayonet catch and a single screw to get to the airbox. And that's held in place with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 screws. So in total, 7 screws to undo before you get to the air filter box. But it's all much more typical and intuitive than on the Suzuki. And when we're talking about adventure suitability, there's also the stock equipment to consider. The KTM at least comes with handguards and a bash plate. The bash plate isn't mounted in an especially robust way, so in a serious case I'd probably get something stronger, but at least there is one. The Suzuki, by contrast, comes practically bare. No handguards, no bash plate, a very exposed header pipe. And that slowly brings us to the conclusion, because the Suzuki is also significantly more expensive than the KTM. 9,990 euros in Austria, 9,699 in Germany, whereas the KTM costs only 6,999 in Austria and 6,299 in Germany. So we're talking about roughly 3,000 euros of difference. And that's a serious amount of money. For me, if I had to choose, the Suzuki is the better bike because it performs better in the areas that matter most to me. What matters to me is how the engine feels, and I just like the stronger torque character more. What also matters to me is a good suspension, and the Suzuki's suspension simply works more sensitively, more smoothly. That said, I'll be honest, my ideal bike would actually be the Suzuki with the ergonomics, stability, and above all the 6-speed gearbox of the KTM. So the KTM isn't inferior in every area, and that's why the Suzuki's ambitious price makes the gap between them tighter. Then you get down to little detail solutions, like the KTM already offering a bit more equipment. It has a fuel cap that stays attached, or brake and clutch levers that can be adjusted without tools. On the Suzuki, you need a flathead screwdriver. The onboard toolkit, as you've seen, is very minimal on the Suzuki. So these are all small points, none of them dramatic in themselves, and they can all be easily fixed if you see them as an issue. But at a price of 10,000 euros, I don't know if it's really justifiable that with the Suzuki there are still so many peripheral details that need to be tweaked or optimized. And as for the KTM, for me personally, the engine isn't really what I'd want from an Enduro, but as I've already said, I think that's very much a matter of taste. Overall, it works really well though, and at a much more attractive price. And I can really see the potential with the KTM, and I'm looking forward to having a lot of fun with it. So my conclusion is really this: think carefully about what matters to you in this kind of bike, and think about how much you're willing to spend for it. I just hope this video has helped to show where the two bikes have their strengths and weaknesses, what you personally value, and how much money you're ready to take out of your wallet. That's something only you can decide for yourself. And with that, I think we've reached the end of the video, and I'll sign off from Hungary. Well, there you have it. Those were our impressions from one day with the KTM 390 Enduro R and the Suzuki DR-Z4S. Now, it's your turn. Let us know your opinion in the comments. And I still hope we'll be lucky enough to get them again for a longer period so we can do a proper trip and really collect all those detailed impressions. But maybe you're not even interested in that. In that case, also write it in the comments. Tell us what kind of tests you'd like to see this season, whether more in the enduro and adventure bike direction, which is my area, or something completely different. The colleagues will read through them and maybe your wish will come true. Otherwise, I'll just say thanks for watching. Thanks to Schaaf for spending the whole day with me, adding his impressions and holding the camera. Now we're here in Günz, right on the Hungarian-Austrian border, a beautiful little town with a small old center. I'm standing right in front of the castle wall, and as a bit of a medieval nerd, that makes me especially happy. We're off for some food now, and then it's time to head home. Thanks again, see you soon, take care, and bye-bye.